Well, if you joined us last week, I had the opportunity to share about the way in which God loves to use people who aren't perfect and don't have it all together or seem to have enough to offer. And I was able to do it by talking about my boyhood hero MacGyver and how he could take a bunch of random junk and make a cool, manly machine to blow stuff up and save the day. As well as the biblical story of Gideon, who God called and raised up to be a mighty warrior, saved Israel despite his fear and insecurities. But I also recognize that MacGyver and Gideon, while amazing, aren't necessarily for everyone when it comes to childhood heroes. While most boys grow up loving stories about warriors, ninjas, and robotic sharks with lasers on their heads, that's not really what my daughters are into, what they want to hear when I tuck them in at night. They would usually prefer to hear about magical unicorns and princesses, maybe a classic fairy tale story with a great king in search of a queen, and a poor orphan girl who sees her wildest dreams come true. And of course you'd have an evil villain up to no good, and an old wizard-like man who guides the young orphan to eventually become a princess and save the world. Well, while you may be thinking I just described the basic plot to almost every Disney princess movie ever made, that is actually another great story in the Bible. An orphan girl who would become a queen. Her name was Esther. And she has a whole book dedicated to what appears to be, on the surface anyway, a very fairy tale life. The kind of dream every little girl wishes upon a star to see come true. So, since I spent so much time last week talking about warriors and building bombs out of duct tape, in the interest of fairness, I decided that today I would go the other direction and talk about a heroic princess who saved the world. A really great story that in the end might just have something more to say to us than the run-of-the-mill Disney movie. So let's find out together, all right? Here we go. All right. Once upon a time, well, 482 BC to be exact, in a great magical empire known as Persia. And no, this isn't Aladdin, there's no genie, but there was a great and mighty king known as Xerxes. And as the Persian emperor, he ruled over the most dominant world power in all the land. He had no equal. And one day, he decided to throw a massive party and invite all the most important people from around the empire in order to show off his wealth, power, and his beautiful trophy wife. We pick up the story, and it says this: on the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. The king became furious and burned with anger. Now you should know, in the queen's defense, she actually had a pretty good reason for refusing. You see, for a noble woman of such high standing, it would have been a really degrading request. In that society, the high-born wealthy women were actually kept out of sight, and they rode around in closed carriages so as not to be seen by lowly common people who were beneath them. So to be drug out and displayed in front of everyone like some prize cow at a county fair would have been socially humiliating and kind of cruel. But the king didn't care. He wanted everyone to see all the beautiful things he owned. So in his anger and the fear of his nobles that a queen saying no to the king could open the door for their wives to get funny ideas, the king decrees the queen be stripped of her title, forever banished from his presence. Which was not really about relationships. In truth, they probably never really even had one or knew each other well. It was more about political influence in her role as queen. Now she would just be another face in his large harem of wives, harem of wives? We'll come back to that. So after this, his attendants proposed a hunt for a new queen. They said, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all those beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let the young women who please the king instead of Vashti become queen." It was basically like Cinderella meets The Bachelor, right? After all, I'm pretty sure being a contestant on The Bachelor is actually a lot more like being a concubine in a king's harem than real dating anyways, but I digress. Okay, now, among the Persian Empire were a small, often persecuted group of people known as the Jews. They were spread out in pockets across the empire because their ancestors had been taken as prisoners and slaves 100 years earlier when their nation fell in a war with Babylon. And it was from their people that we first meet a poor orphan girl named Hadassah, a name she would eventually change to Esther. Esther was being raised by her uncle Mordecai, who took her in after her parents died, and despite her lowly, poor station, somehow she caught the eye of the commissioners and was chosen to go to the palace for a shot at becoming a princess. Every little orphan girl's dream come true. And while there's no mention of glass slippers, pumpkins turning into carriages, or mice making dresses, it does say that despite being a commoner with no real business living in a palace, She won over the overseer who helped make her beautiful for the ball, just like a fairy godmother. It says Esther was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge over the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. You see, it was all about making the best first impression when being seen by the king. So before her turn to be presented, she had to spend a full year being made beautiful with oils and perfumes and cosmetics, every girl's dream, right? And she only had one shot to stand before him and hopefully catch his eye. If not, that was it. But this guy Haggai liked her and helped her. So when her moment came, it said the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. I mean, come on, this story could be one of those rides at Disneyland, am I right? A true fairy tale. But we're not even done. We haven't gotten to the evil villain and Esther and her uncle saving the world. Soon after this, we learn Mordecai came to visit and he overheard a conspiracy to assassinate the king. He tells Esther, who reports to the king and saves his life. But we don't see anything coming from it just yet. The king kind of forgets. Rather, we meet the villain, an arrogant, evil man named Haman. He was the king's right-hand advisor, the second highest position in all the land next to the emperor. And because of his high station, it was customary for people to bow down to him and pay him honor, which he loved. However, Mordecai wasn't having it. He didn't respect him and he wouldn't bow or show honor. He probably saw what a pompous jerk he was like, no way I'm bowing down to that guy. But when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honor, he was enraged, having learned who Mordecai's people were. He scorned the idea of just killing only Mordecai. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. I mean, talk about full-on evil villain stuff here, right? This guy goes for revenge on a global scale. So he goes to the king and he falsely accuses the Jews of being rebellious and planning a revolt. He convinces Xerxes that they need to be suppressed, saying, if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And the king just agrees, not knowing he's being used by the guy he trusts. Pretty standard evil plotline, right? And for some reason, the king's never tipped off by the evil laughing. I never understood that part. But obviously, this raises a panic among the Jews. And Mordecai, in great distress, reaches out to Esther and pleads with her to go to the king and stop all this. Which you'd think, yeah, well, duh, of course, she's a queen, she's a wife, why not? Well, it wasn't that simple. Esther explains to him. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends his gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed and I still haven't been called upon the king. So not even the queen herself could just go out there and talk to him. She would literally be risking her life by just walking into his presence, even being his wife. I mean, we did see how he treated the last one, right? Which doesn't seem quite as Disney-esque, but whatever. Like any good heroic princess, though, Esther faces her most difficult, darkest hour with bravery, declaring, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. The drama, I can't even, right? But of course, this is a fairy tale, and what happens next is just how any great movie script would write it. The king is pleased to see her and offers her anything she wants. So she sets her plan in motion and asks to host a banquet. And she invites Haman to come where she's going to confront him directly. And then that night, after speaking with Esther, the king can't sleep, and he finds himself remembering that time Mordecai, her uncle, saved his life, and he realizes, I never thanked him. So, and this is great, he calls for his advisor to help out. And when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? But Haman thinks the king is talking about him, and he just goes for it. He says, oh, here's my idea. Have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. I mean, talk about laying it on thick, right? But he thinks the king is going to do it for him, so why not? He's going for it. But then the tables turn. The king looks at him and says, oh yeah, okay, go at once. The king commanded, get the robe and the horse, do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew. Dang, you can't make this stuff up, people. Talk about the tables turning, so Haman has to obey. And then it gets even worse for him when at the banquet, in front of everyone, the queen begs the king to spare her and her people from the man trying to kill her. And he's, whoa, who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. Dum, dum, dum. Gotcha. Suffice to say that was the end of the evil Haman. And in perfect poetic justice, the wise old Mordecai is given Hamas's position instead of the king's chief advisor, and all the Jewish people throughout the empire are saved, and they all lived happily ever after. And of course, our poor orphan girl Esther, who rose to be a princess in true Disney fashion, was allowed to return to her place in the king's harem, along with his other 350 concubine wives. Wait, is that? Oh, yeah, that's kind of true, isn't it? Changes the story a little bit, doesn't it? You see, on the surface, Esther reads every bit the dream come true fairy tale, doesn't it? Where all the stars align for a lowly, poor orphan girl, just like Cinderella. Except, if we're being honest, how many of you would let your daughters watch Cinderella if right after the handsome prince slipped the glass slipper onto her foot, she was forced to go join his harem with hundreds of other women all being treated as his property, made to go under extensive physical treatments just to please his ever-wandering lustful eye? If she was destined to live alone and mostly unloved for the rest of her life, except when some king randomly decided to call on her for his own pleasure or to show her off to his friends like some trophy? The truth for Esther was that the title wife didn't really mean much. She had no freedom, she had no rights, no family, no hope for love or intimacy with anyone. She'd never be close to her husband. Even as queen, she was still basically cattle kept for the king's pleasure, to do with whatever he wanted. She was property. And when he didn't want or care about her, life was mostly probably meaningless and lonely. I mean, you think social distancing that we're going through right now is bad? As a member of his harem, she would have spent her entire life confined to the palace. She couldn't leave. And no one in there other than her handlers were allowed to even get close to her. It was breaking the law to even come in contact with her. As a concubine of the king, her only human interaction would actually be with men who were, this is tough, castrated as young boys to ensure that they were never inappropriate with her. They would have been completely emotionless with her. Or about 350 other wives who were all jealous and bitter towards one another, constantly competing for just a sliver of love and attention from this same cold, uncaring man who really saw them all as just possessions. The truth is, Esther likely faced a long, lonely existence, confined to the most beautifully adorned prison cell in the world. Fairy tale? Unicorns? Magic? Honestly, I don't think anyone was wishing upon a star for that kind of life, do you? Okay, well, now that I've ruined the story for all of you, popped your fairy godmother bubble, let me just say this. Personally, I actually think removing the false veneer of everything is wonderful and Esther has the perfect fairy tale life, it actually makes this story way more powerful and impacting for us to hear and read. Because let's just be honest, while it's nice to dream about fairy tales, unicorns, and perfect happily ever afters, that isn't life. It isn't my life, and it probably isn't your life either. Am I right? In real life, things are rarely, if ever, perfect. Even if they may be shiny on the surface. And in some ways, I'd say that's the problem. We talk about this with social media, right? Everyone throws out their fairy tale-esque happy pictures and makes the rest of us think that their life is so perfect and everything's wonderful, when we all know it's not. There's always more to the surface for everyone, especially Esther. But what wasn't a false picture or a glossed over reality in her story is that while her life was far from perfect, she really did experience God do something amazing through her pain. She really did save the world. That part wasn't fake. You see, Esther was not an enchanted princess whose wish upon a star came true and she lived happily ever after. She was a person, just like you, just like me, who was honestly dealt a hand in life that oftentimes she probably wished she could reshuffle. And just like many of you, she had plenty of reasons and opportunities to just throw her hands up in the air and say, this isn't fair. Why me? This isn't the life that I wanted. Why am I going through this? And maybe just give up completely. To say, you know what, there's no way anything good can ever come out of this pain and difficulty, this loneliness, what must have been for her just suffering. And I think many of you watching today can probably relate to the real side of Esther. Work is a struggle. Maybe it's not going like you hoped. Maybe your marriage is on the edge. Just, how are we going to get through this? Family, kids aren't what you dreamed they'd be. Finances are so tight you can barely breathe. Maybe your health is declining. Or like all of us, you just can't take another day of 2020. This madness. And you're saying, how could God do anything with this mess? How could he possibly use me given my circumstances and the pain that I'm in or the things that I'm dealing with? And what's cool is while last week, if you're with us, the story of Gideon was about the problem of looking at yourself and what you don't have when it comes to being used by God. And I wonder if Esther isn't actually a great reminder for us to stop looking at our difficulties, our painful or trying circumstances, as keeping us from being used by him. When in fact, if Esther and the rest of the Bible is any indication, which it is, the opposite is true. Our difficulty and painful circumstances and experiences, they're not disqualifying factors in our lives. They're not keeping God from using us. Rather, they're often the gardens in which God grows his most beautiful miracles. They're often the path towards some of his greatest work. I think Esther is a reminder that there are no perfect fairy tales and that God never promises us our lives will be just easy and enchanted and everything will be perfect. But he does tell us that he will use our pain. He'll take our lowest moments, our trying and most difficult circumstances, and in the words of the Apostle Paul, he'll cause everything to work together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose for them. And I just want to be clear, we throw this verse around a lot in church. This isn't a promise that God is going to fix all your problems and give you a storybook life with unicorns and princesses. Nor is it a promise that everything will turn out great regardless of how you handle it. Oh, God's in charge, everything will be fine in the end. That's nonsense. No, not at all. Rather, it's a promise that if you trust and follow him, love him, by holding on and remaining faithful to him, being willing to be used even in your lowest moments, then nothing will be wasted. Then he can bring something good out of the worst messes we find ourselves in if we keep our eyes on him and continue to trust him through it. And that's so huge to keep in mind. You know, Esther could have handled things very differently, right? I actually read one source that said in many palace harems, they had to keep the women under constant guard, not just so other people couldn't get in, but because oftentimes it was the only way to stop some from them ending their own lives. They were so miserable. Esther could have looked at her situation and just given up, chosen to shut down and simply wallow in misery, but she didn't. We read that she worked to gain favor, sought the best in the situation she was in. She remained faithful, and when her moment came, she acted. And in the end, despite her suffering and pain, or even a little scarier, because of her suffering and pain, she was right where she needed to be for God to use her, for something so great it would be written down in the most widely read book in human history. Her painful journey was actually the path that was always leading to her greatest moment to shine to the world. And she discovered it because she stood strong and remained faithful and didn't give up. And in many ways, I think Esther's story it's less like a Disney fairy tale, and it's actually quite a bit more like the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. If you're familiar with that, he was a guy whose brothers sold him into slavery. And he spent most of his life being mistreated and abused in and out of prison before finally rising to a position of authority due to his faithfulness to God, where he too was able to save others. Or another, even more dramatic story of suffering, of someone who could have easily chosen a comfortable palace life where all his dreams came true, but was instead asked by his Father to walk a path that would end in horrible anguish and pain, death on a cross. And it brought so much sorrow and torment that the night before it was going to go down and happen, he says he was literally sweating blood, and he cried out to God, "My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Here we see Jesus able to express that he would have loved a different way, any way, right? Please, Father, is there any other road that doesn't involve this pain? Is there any other way we can go about without suffering? But if not, if the only path to saving the world goes up that hill towards that cross, let your will be done. I love how Hebrews describes his perspective. He says it was for the joy set before him that he endured the cross. Jesus knew that God was going to use his pain. In your trials, your difficulties, your pain does not disqualify you from being used by God any more than the searing pain of nails through Jesus' hands disqualified him. The opposite was true. It was the pain and the suffering that God used most. And so if our King was willing to faithfully endure and trust God to use his most painful and difficult moments to bring about hope and healing for the world, to believe that it would not be wasted, so should we. Just like Esther, you and I are called to stand strong and faithful through the worst and lowest and trust that God can and will bring something beautiful out of it. Not to keep searching for a perfect fairy tale life, but for our lives to have true meaning and impact through the highs and the lows, because we serve a God who promises to always be with us, to bring beauty from ashes. If we trust and keep following him, he will use our pain to bring hope and healing to the world. He is the God who takes graves and makes gardens, who makes beautiful things out of dust.